Okay, very good. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for organizing a conference in the middle of what is still a COVID world. So I do appreciate your efforts to overcome the challenges of time and space here. So my talk will be a sketch of Eurasia, as you can see here, from 1300 to 1550 or so. I have no expertise in metal type or type culture, so I can just give a background and hopefully that will be of some use. So as you all know, this is the last page of the Jikji text. And the part that I want to look at is the very last couple of lines. And so the Jikji text is dated to 1377, but that, of course, is the Western dates. And what it actually says is the one day in the 7th month of Xuanguang Dingsi, Dingsi or Zhongsha, is part of the 60-year lunar cycle. In Xuanguang or Songguang is a reign title. And as everyone here knows, up until the 20th century, every ruler in East Asia used an auspicious 2-character phrase to denote a period of time when they were on the throne. And sometimes they were long, sometimes they were short, but they were all political claims. And in East Asian political culture, to use the dating of a sovereign's reign period was to recognize his or her political legitimacy. And inversely, to refuse to use a particular reign period was a clear statement that you rejected or did not acknowledge their sovereignty or legitimacy. So Xuanguang was the reign period of an emperor from the Yuan dynasty. Here you can see the great Yuan in the north, the Ming in the south. This is after 1368. We'll come back to this in a second. But Xuanguang was the reign date of Ayushiri Dada. Ayushiri Dada was the Yuan emperor in 1377, and he was the Mongolian great Khan, the Khagan. And up until 1368, the Great Yuan had ruled most of today's People's Republic of China, Mongolia, and had also exercised a profound influence over the Korean Peninsula and the Tibetan Plateau. In 1377, in contrast, Ayushiri Dada oversaw only a portion of the Mongolian steppe. The Yuan dynasty had lost nearly all of its Chinese territory to the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty was founded in 1368 by Zhu Yanzhang, who you see here, who had established his own reign title of Hongwu. So the question is, why in 1377 did the Korean monk, Baekun, use the reign period of a defeated, diminished Mongolian great Khan rather than the reign title of the newly ascended Ming dynasty? In fact, most of you know that between 1370 and 1374, the Goryeo government, King Gongming, had used the Hongwu reign period because he had felt that an alliance with the Ming dynasty offered greater advantages than one with the Mongols. So 1377 was a time of great uncertainty. And so this is a theme that I'll be talking about throughout my talk tonight, is uncertainty. The second half of the 14th century was a time of intense political turmoil throughout Eurasia. Domestically, Korea experienced coups, sudden changes on the throne, purges, at least one regicide, the murder of an emperor, King Gongmin, and eventually the fall of the Goryeo dynasty. Korea suffered scores of attacks by coastal marauders, 2 incursions by invading Chinese rebel armies, the temporary loss of both of its capitals, an attack by a UN army, and repeated threats of cataclysmic destruction by the new Ming Emperor Zhuge. In just 2 decades, between 1356 and 1376, the Goryeo dynasty had first unilaterally restructured its alliance with the Yuan dynasty, then abolished formal relations with the Yuan, then allied with the Ming, then rejoined the Yuan, and then attempted reconciliation with the Ming dynasty. So all of this suggests that no one knew what the future would bring. Would the Mongols mount a revival? Would the Ming dynasty last? Was it possible to establish good relations with both the Ming and the Yuan? Now, I highlight these unknown variables as a simple reminder that we cannot assume that technology or technological transmission occurs automatically or naturally, right? Or put it more positively, that we should really appreciate the fact that technology can move across space in very difficult times. And so the idea that Korean metal type might spread around the globe was not a given. We cannot assume that it happened by itself. It really needs to be shown that it happened. So my presentation today is in 5 parts. Very simply, the Mongol Empire, the collapse of the Mongol Empire, East-West ties during this time period, and then looking more specifically at Korea, ties to the continent, and finally, a few takeaway points. So the first part, the Mongol Empire, is the most simple. The Mongol Empire integrated more people, materials, practices, and ideas in East Asia or in Eurasia as a whole more tightly than ever before in human history. And here we see some of the trade routes. We say that we saw the massive span of territory under Mongolian control. Now, the Mongol Empire was driven by 2 basic motives. First, it wanted to move people and ideas, whether they're military, whether they're administrative, technological, across large spans of territory. And it also had a keen appreciation of wealth and luxury. And so in order to move people and in order to gain wealth, it did 2 things. At first, significantly expanded previous networks of overland and maritime transportation. And second, it actively promoted long, medium, and short distance trade. As one well-known historian puts it, the geopolitical medium, through its merchants and their goods circulated, have become increasingly frictionless, and continuous. So is it easier to move farther than ever before in human history? All right. Now, the fall. I've talked again and again about the Mongol Empire's collapse, but there was no single event or moment that marked the end. More similar to a long agony than a sudden death is how one scholar puts it. Later, historians gave us misleadingly clear signposts. So the Yuan dynasty, we are told, collapsed in 1368 or 1388. The Ilkhanate drew to a close in 1335, and the Golden Horde ended in 1502. For contemporaries, people who lived at the time, however, deterioration lasted for decades, and few believed that it was inevitable or irreversible. Both Mongols and others fully expected partial or full revivals. So put in other words, the decades of Mongol rule's deterioration were defined by uncertainty. And just to give you some sense of that, this is a short excerpt from a letter written by a Chinese scholar about these periods. And he's describing the 1350s and 1360s we don't have to look at the whole thing, just the first line and last line. So he begins with, it's been nearly 20 years now of death and destruction within the realm. And then he finishes this excerpt, in a word, things have never been worse than now. So a very bleak assessment of his world. Right? In that sense of chaos and fragmentation of the 1350s and 1360s stood in stark contrast to the glories of unified Mongol rule just a few years earlier. And this is section 3 now, moving on, East-West contact. So as an example of those East-West contacts, I want to look at a moment in 1342. On August 19th, 1342, Giovanni de Marignoli arrived at the Mongol court in Shangdu. He was an envoy who was dispatched by Pope Benedict VII, who had submitted what the Mongols call an extraordinary horse. And they presented it to Togon Timur, who is the Yuan emperor sitting on the throne in the painting that you see before you. And so the Pope's gift was in response to an embassy that Togon Timur, that the Yuan emperor had previously sent in 1336 to the Pope with prayers with requests for prayers and for gifts of horses. Now, the major reason behind the Yuan emperor's mission to the Pope was a request by some of his military men. These military men were Asuds or Alans. That is, they were from the Caucasus. They'd been conquered by the Mongols, then integrated into the Mongol Empire, then distributed throughout the entire Mongolian Empire, and they ended up in the Yuan. Now, they were Christian. And as Christians, they wanted a new pastor to care for their spiritual needs. And so they'd sent the mission, and then the horse was a sort of return gift from the Pope to the emperor. The gift of the horse was welcomed, and the Yuan court depicted the presentation of the horse as evidence of the glories of the Yuan dynasty, and that it was an age of prosperity and order, and that the reputation of the Yuan emperor had spread throughout the entire world. If we move forward, so that was 1342, a moment of great glory. If we move forward, we see the very few vestiges or traces of that glorious moment. So in 1360, let's look first at horses. I'll look at horses, then the Asuds, and then depiction. So first the horses. Right? In 1360, one rebel warlord, you can see on the map here, Fan Guozhen, represents what are called Western horses to Zhu Yanzhang, the future founder of the Ming dynasty. Western horses was the same phrase that was used to describe the gift by the Pope. So it's the same language. But Western horses here are being given from one rebel leader to another rebel leader, who are both defying the authority of the Yuan dynasty. And Western horses tells us nothing about where those horses were actually from. Were they from Western Europe? Were they from West Asia? Were they from Central Asia? We don't know. We just know that they were from west of China. So they used the expression Western horses. In the 1380s and 1390s, trade and diplomatic contacts between the Ming court and Central Asian polities, most importantly, the Timurids, you see on the left-hand side of your map, began slowly. And then the pace increased in the early 15th century. So in 1409, rulers in places like the oasis city of Karahoja sent more than 500 Western horses to the Ming court. And in 1413, envoys from the Timurids and elsewhere arrived in Beijing, again, with Western horses, lions, leopards, and other items. In those cases, Western horses indicates animals from Central Asia, but it does not clarify whether the horses were bred in Timurid lands or had been acquired through trade from more distant places. So again, thinking there's possibility that they had gotten the horses from Western Europe or elsewhere through trade. We just don't know. All right, that was the horses. Let's look now at the Asuds. So Asud military personnel had remained tied to the Great Khan even after he left Chinese territory and moved into the steppe in 1368. So in 1372, some 7,000 Asud men who had been fighting for the Yuan court surrendered to the Ming throne. And throughout the remainder of the 14th century, Asud men continued to join the Ming throne and were given positions in the Ming military. Now, the question is whether those Asud communities maintain ties to Western Europe as they had during the Yuan dynasty. All right. Now, let's look at presentations between courts. We saw a presentation of those Western horses from the Pope to the Yuan Emperor. Now, let's look at a different sort of presentation. And these are presentations between the Ming court and Central Asian courts. During the 15th century, painters, probably based in Herat or Samarkand, produced several finely detailed images of Ming envoys that you can see in the little red box, presenting gifts to Timurid rulers. Now, dating is very difficult, and art historians usually use broad terms like 15th century, but one authority has dated one of these paintings to 1444. Now, to sum up this section, as Mongol power deteriorated in the second half of the 14th and the first half of the 15th centuries, trade and politics dipped, but continued to link Mongolia to not only Chinese, but also Central Asian lands. Now, some Western Europeans were aware of those connections. So 1403, 1405, there's an ambassador of Henry III of Castile, a man named Clavijo, who saw Chinese goods in the markets of Samarkand and remarked in his travel account of all the imported goods in the city, he wrote, quote, "The richest and most precious of all were from China. For the craftsmen of Cathay," that is China, "are reputed to be the most skillful by far, beyond those of any other nation," unquote. The contrast here is with Marco Polo and Marignoli, the Pope's envoy, who had seen Chinese goods in China. Here, Clavijo is seeing Chinese goods, but only in Samarkand because he was unable to make the trip all the way to the other end of Eurasia into China. Now, look next at networks of transmission and the movement of people within East Asia during the late 14th century. The evidence here is mixed. During the 1350s, 1360s, the Yuan court lost control over critical transportation infrastructure, things like imperial highways, waterways, and coastal sea roads. People, however, did continue to move, sometimes great distances. So for instance, during the 1340s, 1350s, 1360s, the Yuan dynasty was able to mobilize large military forces, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, and they moved hundreds of miles. Officials took up posts in distant areas. Envoys dispatched by the Yuan court, by Yuan regional commanders, by Chinese warlords, men like Fan Guozhen, Zhu Yanzhang that we just saw, and the Korean king, King Gongmin, dispatched envoys that traveled between all of the major cities in East Asia. So Daidu, Shangdu, Taiyuan, Kyoto, Gaegyong. So there's lots of people moving around, and those are, again, potential avenues of transmission. However, in all of those cases, movement had grown more difficult and dangerous. So those Yuan armies that I was talking about, oftentimes they were living off the land. They were pillaging local communities to feed themselves. Local officials went to their posts, but they went so infrequently that it was worth special praise if they did actually go and take up their post. Their biographers would make a big point of that. And we have one large group that we know almost nothing about, and we don't know what they transmitted. And these are refugees, right? During times of wars, refugees increase, but refugee movement was almost always illicit and very often ill-documented. So it's very difficult to reconstruct the routes, their numbers, and their experiences, but another potential route of transmission. And move on to the steppe here. Although the Mongol Empire was collapsing, the steppe did remain tied to parts of Eurasia. And the image here is of Karakoto, Heishuichang in Western Inner Mongolia. And this was one of the Mongols' urban centers that survived fairly long and continued to serve as a transportation and trade hub. And what's particularly interesting for our purposes here today is it used the Xuanguang, or Hongguang reign title. And you see here in the document, this is from 1372. So just about the time of the Jikji. And the Xuanguang reign date is also used on the seals. And so from the Ming dynasty's point of view, Karakoto remained an important center, and the Ming dynasty periodically sent troops and sent spies there to gather information. And this is based on the assumption that East and Central East Asian traders continued to gather there. And so it's a good place to get information. All right. Now, the Ming founder, we mentioned him, when he came to power, he imposed very strict restrictions on private maritime trade. The state restrictions did not end maritime trade or overseas travel, but they much reduced its scale.
Dr. Robinson, we only have 7 minutes left.
Yep, I'm exactly on time. Thank you. And so I've lost my place. So the scale of transmission, the scale of trade went down but did not end. His immediate successors, the Yongle Emperor, instituted huge maritime expeditions between 1405 and 1433, which were very important because it meant a massive infusion of Chinese power, but also Chinese trade goods throughout South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And it's very possible that that massive infusion stimulated broader networks of trade and transmission as the world was emerging from the Mongol collapse. So again, to skip ahead here a little bit, the Mongol Empire collapsed, restoration of networks happened, but they were uneven and it was a bit slow. The 15th century and the 16th century, I'll skip because it mostly is beyond what we're really concerned here. But that's when we see the emergence of what we think of usually as the early modern world, when Chinese goods started to move readily to not only East Asia, but Central Asia, and eventually to West Europe, and also to the New World. This is the mid-16th century, as you see here, is when New World silver begins to flow into China. And we can really talk about a global empire and global, the full emergence of global transmission of technologies. Korea, move through this fairly quickly. Now, most of you know that during the Mongol Empire, Korea had become, a part of the Mongol Empire. And this meant that the Mongol royal family spent large periods of time in Mongolia, where they had lots of opportunity to meet with elites from a variety of places and to travel widely. Korean monks also went and traveled widely. Korean palace women and tribute and eunuchs served in the palaces. So all of this created a deep connection, a deep set of connections that made possible transmission of culture. Now, the contrast with Korea's position vis-a-vis the Ming is very different. So Korean royals did not marry the Ming royal house. They did not stay in the Ming court for long periods of time. They did not serve in elite units like the Geishig, the imperial court. They did not maintain residences. They did not travel. And so this meant that there was far less opportunity for an exchange of information and material objects. Now, my 5 basic points here are right here, and you can read them. Maybe you have a Korean translation, but in essence, the collapse of the Mongol Empire decreased the global flow of things, technologies. Movements slowed but never stopped. Early Ming policies varied. Illegal private trade increased until it took on sort of a global expanse. And finally, Korea was very much part of those global developments. And that's sort of the general contextualization, I think, for thinking about the transmission of the metal type in Korea to other parts of the world. So thank you very much.